So today I'm delighted to have operator Starsky with me, and I have watched, I think, every one of his videos, and I might have missed one somewhere along the way, but he provides so much context. Everything that I try to do on my channel is providing context so that you understand what's going on in Ukraine more fully. So, Operator Starsky, I am thrilled to have you here. Can you introduce yourself so that people who might not be familiar with you can understand your background?
Sure. Thank you so much, Professor. It's a big pleasure to meet you. Because there's a lot of different YouTubers out there supporting Ukraine and reviewing everything that happens in Ukraine and around Ukraine, but not a lot academic YouTubers.
Mhm.
So it's a big pleasure. As for myself. My name is Andrew. People mostly know me as Operator Starsky. I'm a press officer in the 4th Operative Brigade of the National Guard of Ukraine, called the Frontier, so-called Assault Guard or Offensive Guard. And I've been out there in the fields since late 2014, early 2015. I had numerous deployments to the front lines back in the days when we had the anti-terrorist operation. Later, it was transformed into the joint force operation in Donbass, and I was in the infantry mostly. Since 2018, I work as a press officer because my commanders learned that I had experience in communications. Basically, all my background is related to communications. That's why they made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
Mhm.
So I became a press officer.
Okay. So help me with something I think I understand, but I'd like to see your perspective. So my first question is this: why did Ukrainians stand and fight? Like the week before the invasion, I'm sitting in the cafeteria with my colleagues, and we're talking about Putin's not going to do that. Like this was a conversation everybody was having everywhere in mid-February of 2022. Why did Ukrainians stand and fight? Like when it actually happened, I was shocked. I was like, how did I get it so wrong? But like Ukrainians, like they stood up. Tell me what's going on. Something was going on. It wasn't just Zelensky saying do this. There's something in Ukrainian culture or the mentality or something.
Well, first of all, we have this neighbor, unfortunately, called Russia for centuries. And they did numerous attempts to eliminate Ukrainian identity. They attacked us. They tried to enslave, assimilate Ukrainians for centuries. I believe the first war between Russians and Ukrainians happened around 1,000 years ago. Unfortunately, we failed back then. But you can see that this neighbor tries to invade Ukraine over and over again for almost 1,000 years. And the reason why we are fighting is because we want to survive. We
Mhm.
want to see our kids being alive and happy, but most important, alive. And that's the reason why we're fighting, because we have our families behind our backs. And if we give up, there will be no Ukraine. A
Yep.
lot of people don't understand that if Russia stops fighting, the war will end. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine will
Yeah.
end.
Yeah, Napoleon said that the moral is to the physical as three is to one. Like you have morale in spades. The Russians don't seem to. The Russians seem to have. Um, I heard early reports where the Russians were coming to liberate you from the Nazis. Like some of the early soldiers were told that, and like little old ladies were like, "Where are the Nazis? Well, there's no Nazis here. What are you doing? You stop that." And now I think they know that there's no Nazis there, even if they've been told this. I mean, I'm sure word has gotten back, but they're not particularly motivated to get slaughtered.
Yeah, so the Russians will call Nazis everyone who doesn't support Russian chauvinism.
Mhm.
Um, NATO, like the whole NATO bloc, is Nazi to Russians.
Mhm.
It's not a secret to anybody, and they. The reason why they call everybody Nazi is basically because they need some reason for Russians to hate their enemies. Because if you're
Yeah,
invader by your nature, it's very hard to convince your citizens why you should hate those people,
right.
and that's why they call everyone Nazi. Doesn't matter if you're a black guy from Brooklyn, Asian guy from or girl from like Sydney or whatever, you will be Nazi because you don't support Russian chauvinism and Russian um, like will to eliminate Ukraine.
Yeah, and I just talked about that yesterday where, if there are Nazis, or 2 days ago, if there are Nazis, then that allows them to flip from being an aggressor to a defender, right? Like, they're defending against Nazis as opposed to, "No, you're invading another land." So one of my viewers, described this, and I think this is right, but, correct me if I'm wrong. The mentality between the Russians and Ukrainians is the difference between serfs and Cossacks. Does that sound right to you? Does that ring true? And when he said it, I thought, wow, Ozzy, you got that. That's absolutely right. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Cossacks were free people, and the story behind Cossacks is when Ukrainians wanted to run away from like being enslaved, or they wanted to break free basically, or fight for freedom. They would run away from their villages to the Zaporizhian siege and join the Cossack infantry, which was one of the strongest infantry in the 16th, 15th. Basically, Cossacks have much older story, but I mean history. But the strongest they were the strongest around 15th, 16th, 17th century with
Mhm.
introduction of firearms, because Cossacks were absolutely crazy about muskets and firearms. There's multiple excavations were found in Ukraine with all types of firearms of that time, and which is very interesting because Cossacks are usually portrayed with a saber, but according to what we know, according to historical fact, they would prefer firearms over cold weapons, over blades.
Mm. Tell me about leadership that you've observed. Now, it seems almost like you'd feel like you're tooting your own horn if you were just to talk about this, but I want the audience, an international audience, to hear about leadership, heroism, like the things that you have observed within the ranks in Ukraine. Even you can even extend it into the political in Ukraine if they've done something that is admirable. Tell us about those things, because that doesn't get out into the press when people are consumed with the battle maps and what's happening between different political figures. So enlighten us to the things that you've seen. You're well on the inside. We're not. We're trying to support you, but we want to hear about these kind of things.
To me, uh, to me personally, I think Ukraine started changing in a better way during the Revolution of Dignity. That's when I saw this heroism for the first time. And it was when we were all united against the dictatorship, against this pro-Russian influence dragging us into this Russian swamp forever. We didn't want that as
Mhm.
Europeans. And during the Revolution of Dignity, I saw people united um, around this fight for freedom. There were uh, when you enter Maidan during the Revolution of Dignity, okay, it's like a parallel reality, because suddenly you can see like the best people uh, surrounding you, and you can see volunteers running around with hot tea because it was cold like hell. I remember I was sick for like 3 months straight,
Mm.
and because we were patrolling and doing all kinds of duty, and there were volunteers with hot tea, with ginger, with different sandwiches. They were running around and handing us like tea and hot beverage. There were people who cared, actually, who cared about future. I remember when I believe it was in early December 2013, when the police decided to disperse the protesters in the night, and the police units arrived from Crimea to Kiev, and they decided to attack in the night. And in the night, uh, there was like a complete uprising in Kiev. All Kiev
Mhm.
was awake, and people were arriving from all around the city. And suddenly there were probably hundreds of thousands of people outside on the streets in the middle of the night. Those were fantastic days, even though I was sick most of the time. Um, but then there was annexation of Crimea, there was invasion of Donbass, and again, people uh, decided that we have no other option but fight.
Mhm.
Uh, the National Guard of Ukraine, the military force that I serve at, it was created from those police officers and protesters. Basically, two different groups that were fighting each other. But
In 2014, it was created. Is that what you're saying?
yes, exactly.
Wow. Okay.
And when our Donbass was invaded, when Crimea got annexed, those people realized that we actually have one enemy,
Yeah.
which is Russia. We don't have to fight against each other, because that's exactly what Russia wants.
Yep.
And that's why those people united. This is how the National Guard was formed. And speaking of heroism, I can recall my guys from my brigade, their incredible sacrifice in those months. They were protecting Rubizhne and Severodonetsk, and currently they are fighting again on one of the most dangerous spans of the front lines. Um, so those people are heroes to me, absolutely. And um, there were guys who returned from Rubizhne, for example, last year in summer, and they could barely speak because of shell shocks, because of the constant shelling 24/7. A lot of people cannot realize
Yeah.
what it means, even because uh, the way Russians managed to capture Rubizhne is by basically destroying it to the ground. They left a desert, and it's very hard to defend something that doesn't exist. Um, and they did it using tanks, using heavy artillery, using bombs, using cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. And my guys were there for months without leaving the front line, without leaving their positions, and they are heroes to me, 100%.
So that speaks to the Russian way of war as opposed to the way that Ukrainians have fought. So the Russians, from my outside perspective, what the Russians try to do is not have an infantry fight, but just use artillery to destroy the place. If they don't have that, then they have this human wave kind of attacking, which doesn't make any sense. In one of your videos, you were talking about like, look, this is the 10th time they've done this, and we've destroyed them each time. Like it's not like they're learning. And so the morale it seems to me, is very low because the leadership doesn't care about their soldiers. Everything that I've seen about Ukraine has been valuing human life of their soldiers. Yes, they have to accomplish the mission, but if they can preserve that human life, they're going to try to do that. Can you speak to that kind of perception, how Ukrainians actually operate? Like what, like there was a Pentagon official that said on a scale of 1 to 10, Ukrainians are a 12 militarily. And I think there's something to that. It's been pretty amazing.
Well, probably, yeah, probably it's because we're fighting for survival. But speaking of Russians, they used artillery a lot for one very specific reason. So in the beginning, they tried to just roll through Ukraine in columns without expecting any sort of resistance. But then they realized when they started losing incredible amount of people on a daily basis, they realized that they are very, very bad in contact combat
Mhm.
against Ukrainian armed forces. And the reason for that was we spent 8 years learning how to fight against Russians, specifically in Donbass. And also we had a lot of like direct combat experience. We had approximately 400,000 men that passed through anti-terrorist operation, joint force operation, and they knew how to fight. They had combat experience. Russians, even though they had some very good training, because they spent 1 year, approximately 1 year training in Belarus, they had approximately 190,000 men of personnel. But still, we were better trained and we were more experienced. So they realized that in order to make up for that, they decided to use artillery. They decided to use their tanks, attack helicopters, and it's something that we faced approximately in April, no, March, approximately in March near Huta Mazhigirska. It's north of Moshun, north and west of Moshun, when they used their attack helicopters, and we experienced massive shelling. Unfortunately, we lost some men there, but that's when Russians realized that in order to save whatever was left from their so-called elite troops, they first decided to use their artillery and all kinds of long-range weapons. In Rubizhne, it was absolutely insane because, for example, we had like one howitzer versus 17 Russian howitzers.
Mhm.
That was the difference. Um, but luckily, currently, we can use more sophisticated, more advanced artillery that has greater range, and I'm talking about NATO howitzers. Those have greater range, better precision, which eliminates any possibility of Russians to use counter battery measures. Um, so hopefully we will be better and better at this.
You have the army, you have the National Guard, and you have grandpa with a shotgun, right? So so tell me about the role that civilians have played. I mean, I'm sure you've seen, like, beyond 2014, civilians, my reading tells me that civilians were huge in stopping things coming down toward Bucha. Is that, I mean, they were putting obstacles up and cutting, certain lines and right? I mean, so it's like the whole nation seems to it's like a swarm of bees. Yet no, you're not coming here. And I think the Russians weren't prepared for that, but I'm sure that there has been a heroic effort by the civilian population as well. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, so Ukrainians, we have this feature, probably like national feature. We are very, very self-organized.
Mhm.
And when every time we face some kind of problem like that, we are trying to self-organize, because we will not expect a command from top, or we will not expect. I'm talking about civilians,
Yeah.
or some advice or whatever. We will act every time. That's why we had so many guerrillas, right, in around Irpin and around Bucha, and in Kherson also.
Mhm.
There are numerous videos of like just local teens riding a car, throwing Molotov at
Mhm.
Russian vehicles.
The pickle
Um,
jar.
yeah, yeah. So that's one of our national features here in Ukraine. We are very, very self-organized, and for the first time, I noticed that during the Revolution of Dignity again, because um, there is this uh, fake that is very, very popular among pro-Russian supporters and Russians as well. That, for example, there was a coup in Ukraine. The coup is when there is some specific political or military or religious force, some kind of movement that takes over the power in the country. Uh, During the Revolution of Dignity, there was no single force that would control the Maidan, control the
Mhm.
people at Maidan. People were acting themselves all the time.
This might be related. My son wanted me to ask a question. We were talking last night, and he wanted me to ask why Ukrainians are so innovative and creative. Like my son is all into drones, and like so he will send me videos of Ukrainian drone clips of things, and but there is something. Maybe it's related to the self-organized, self-motivated, but there's a very innovative streak with what the Ukrainians have been able to do, or how they've been able to technologically advance or modify things or whatever. Is that part of the cultural difference? Like when you look at the Russian army, it's unless you're above a colonel, you're waiting for orders. Like I'm not doing anything, I'm waiting for them to tell me. Right? It's a very different mentality.
Yeah, we do that all the time, and not only in regards to combat. It's like this: whenever Ukrainian is bored, he will do all kinds of crazy stuff. When you arrive to a Ukrainian position, no matter what it is, like there is a trench, there is like a small garden with onions
Yeah.
and stuff like that, and I think it's cultural.
Okay. Well, that answers a big question then. That's really interesting. So, if you wanted to tell one story, just one thing that you wanted to impress those of us in an international audience with about what you have observed about leadership, heroism, anything along those lines, what one story since 2022 invasion would you be telling us? What would you like us to know?
Oh my God, there were so
I'm
many
sure
of
there's a
them.
lot. I know I'm asking for a lot here.
There were so many of them. To me, my first and only combat during this war was the defense of Hostomel,
Right.
and I remember that our military firefighters, the firefighters serving in my brigade, they are servicemen who can operate AK as well as their firefighting machine. So those were shooting Russian helicopters.
Mhm.
And I believe I told this story many times, but it's like still it's so amazing. They were shooting Russian helicopters, and they were so I would say so involved in this, so dedicated. And at first, I was a bit concerned. Like, what's the point of shooting Russian helicopters? They are armored, flying tanks, as they say. But eventually, they managed to shoot down a helicopter, and I'm talking about Ka-52 Alligator, using concentrated small arms fire.
That's amazing.
Yeah, well, I believe that probably because there are those big air intakes. Probably if you shoot at the air intake, probably the bullet can ricochet down into a turbine and damage it. Maybe that's just a theory, but still, they managed to shoot down one helicopter, and I was so impressed. And that's when everybody started screaming like crazy, and everybody joined us. So it's just one of the stories. Actually, I believe every day in our country since the beginning of this war and until it ends, I believe that's the story of a true heroism of my people.
Yeah, and you talk about that like it's not a big thing, but that's a big thing. Stopping that airport from being occupied really was important in those early days. I mean, that was huge to thwart the Russians' success. Okay, I have some viewer questions because yesterday I put out, hey, if you were going to ask Starsky anything, what would you ask? The first one was what you just said. If it was surreal to have actually been in the critical battle at Hostomel on that first day, and I'm imagining it was quite an experience. So, okay, second one. This was 71 Charger 318 said, what does he think would be the best preferred Ukrainian cuisine for foreigners to sample when they come to visit Ukraine? What sort of care packages would most benefit Ukraine forces on the front line? So, two questions there, but you've offered in the past for those who want to come see you afterwards.
First of all, borscht, 100%. And there are different types of borscht. There's some specific recipe for borscht in different oblasts of Ukraine, but people will be surprised to learn that there's also green borscht that has a completely different recipe. That my big advice is to try that one, and vareniki with cherries. That is something heavenly. So that's something that people
And you highlighted both of those in the past, yeah. So the care packages, what could people watching this who care about it send, and how would they get it to you? Well, like who would they send it to? What should they send?
It depends. So currently we are looking at approaching summertime, and I don't think that our soldiers will need like heaters and
Sure.
things like that. The thing that they do really need all the time is drones and cars. uh, that is something very, very crucial, because we need more vehicles to be able to deliver personnel to the front lines, deliver ammunition, and to evacuate the wounded. And as for the drones, I don't think I should explain, because it's crucial to have drones, not only those smaller ones that we use on a tactical level, but also some drones that can be used on operational level, with the range of around 40 kilometers. That would be awesome, of course, but they're too expensive.
So the
So
extra range, does that come from the? So my son and I were talking about this yesterday because we were talking about drones, and is it the extra life batteries, the longer life batteries that are needed to provide extra range? Would that help, or is it not? Is it not just that?
basically batteries, and probably drones that can withstand the Russian electronic warfare machines.
Right. Because now, if I understand, that's the DGI had the Chinese parts, and then the Russians have been able to knock those down. So I was asking, like, so how could we get around that? What do we do? And that's a critical piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, well, one of the solutions is when a drone, and for example a winged drone, uh, when it's programmed to fly using autopilot without any connection to the outside world.
Mhm.
um, but again, the GPS modules can be suppressed, so yeah, it's still a big problem.
Okay. The last two questions, and I'll let you say whatever you want to say at the end. The last two questions are a little less um useful than than this one. Do you know the criminal series? This is Vlad Flatten TR6TU. Ask if he knows the criminal series Starsky and Hutch from the, he said 80s, but I think it was 70s.
I believe so. I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Every time I hear your name, that's exactly what I think of. And there's a distinctive car with a stripe on it. And yeah, anyway. Okay. And the last thing, do you believe that NATO deserves to be allowed into Ukraine after this war is over?
Yes, 100%. I'll tell you this: if there were NATO troops stationed in Ukrainian cities, they would never be bombed, because that's something that Russia is not prepared for. They never attacked any NATO country in their history.
So
Uh,
they asked it in a distinctive way, not if Ukraine should be allowed into NATO, but if NATO should be allowed to join Ukraine.
I
I
would not overestimate Ukraine in this way, but actually, we cooperated with NATO troops for years. In 2016, my brigade took part in the Rapid Trident 2016 in Yavoriv, that's near Lviv, where we have this international center for preparing and training the peacekeepers. And we had mutual training with different NATO armies, with our colleagues. Later, we cooperated with Unifier, our Canadian colleagues,
Mhm.
and they gave us a lot of very important experience. For example, in 2021, we were learning the urban combat. Basically, we spent all the year learning urban combat, and then we had multiple trainings. And then the next year there was Rubizhne and Severodonetsk, and that's where we showed some incredible results.
Yep.
I would not underestimate NATO. They are great guys, and we learned a lot
This
from
was
them.
his way of paying you all a huge compliment by saying it that way. You hear Putin and Lavrov and others give this nonsensical answer that, well, they're about to join NATO. They couldn't have joined NATO. Well, not since 2014 when they were partially occupied, and they know that. So that's just nonsense propaganda. Okay, I'm going to let you say whatever you want to say as a last word, and to be done with this interview. Thank you again for your time. What else do you want the international audience that's watching this? My audience is primarily American and some European, with little smatterings around the world and other places. What's the last thing that you would like them to impress on them?
I would like to say big thanks for supporting my country. Uh, it's something that probably never happened in history before. At least I don't remember anything like that. But this global support of Ukraine is so amazing, and all Ukrainians appreciate it. And I'm sure that we will never forget this. So thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.